What if the person sworn to uphold the law became the one hiding the darkest secret of all? A respected correctional officer, a forbidden affair behind bars, and a brutal murder that sent shockwaves through the entire prison system. This wasn't just another crime, it was a desperate attempt to erase a truth so dangerous. It could destroy everything, and in the end, the cover-up was even more shocking than the crime itself. This is not just another prison scandal, it's a story of power, fear, and deception. A man who controlled the fates of inmates couldn't even control his own. A secret so deadly, he was willing to kill to keep it buried. But no matter how carefully he tried to erase the truth, the walls were always watching, and so was justice. Welcome to Shocking Real-Life Crime Stories, where we uncover the darkest secrets behind the most shocking crimes. If you think you've seen it all, this case will make you question everything. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of a crime that proves the truth always comes to light, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. Desmond Tate was everything a correctional officer was supposed to be, at least on paper. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the discipline of a former soldier, a man who had served in the military before trading in his camouflage for a badge. His reputation at Claiborne Correctional Facility was built on respect, control, and fear. He ran the prison with an iron grip, ensuring inmates followed the rules and officers stayed in line. His fellow guards saw him as the model officer, someone who never let his emotions get in the way of duty. No favoritism, no bending of the rules, no weakness. Outside the prison walls, Desmond played the role of the perfect family man. Married for 15 years to his devoted wife, Latasha, they raised 2 children in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. He was a deacon at his church, a man who spoke about discipline, morality, and the importance of family values to everyone who knew him. A man of order, integrity, and unwavering principles. But behind the uniform, behind the sermons, and behind the carefully constructed image, Desmond Tate was hiding a truth so dark, he couldn't even face it. Claiborne Correctional Facility wasn't just his workplace, it was his hunting ground. For years, whispers circulated through the prison halls about Officer Tate and the way he treated certain inmates differently. His watchful eyes lingered too long. His presence in certain areas of the prison seemed a little too convenient. Some inmates swore they had seen him slipping into cells late at night. But no one dared speak too loudly because Desmond Tate wasn't just feared, he was untouchable. He had built a fortress around his secret, convincing himself that no one would ever know. He was always in control, always above suspicion. But what happens when the enforcer becomes the one breaking the rules? What happens when the one who punishes criminals becomes the very thing he condemns? Desmond Tate thought he had mastered the art of deception. But secrets, especially deadly ones, always find their way to the surface. In the world of Claiborne Correctional Facility, power was everything, and Rico Valentine knew exactly how to wield it. At 29 years old, Rico possessed a charm that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't like the other inmates. He walked through the prison halls with a swagger that defied the very nature of his confinement. He wasn't scared, he wasn't ashamed, and he refused to be broken. Unlike most men locked behind cold iron bars, Rico was openly gay, a fact that made him both a target and a mystery in a place where pride could get you killed. Yet he refused to cower. He refused to hide. Desmond Tate had always been the one to exert control. But now, the tables were beginning to turn. He never shrank into the background. Rico Valentine carried himself with the same confidence and charisma that had made him a legend in the streets before prison. Fast money, parties, and influence flowed through his hands like water. Arrested on drug-related charges, Rico never lost his edge behind bars. He had a reputation. If you needed a favor, protection, or a secret kept, Rico could make it happen. The guards hated him for it, but most of them played along. They knew that Rico had connections both inside and outside the prison walls. And then there was Desmond Tate. The first time Desmond saw Rico, he felt it immediately, the tension, the disgust, the undeniable pull. Desmond despised Rico, or at least that's what he told himself. To Desmond, Rico was everything he stood against: loud, shameless, unapologetically himself. Desmond believed in control, order, and discipline. With Rico, there was none of that. At first, Desmond made it his personal mission to break him. He pushed him harder than any other inmate, extra cell searches, random shakedowns, unprovoked hostility. But Rico took it all with a smirk, as if he already knew what Desmond was trying to hide. Then something changed. The tension shifted. The disgust turned into curiosity. The hatred began to feel more like obsession. Desmond found himself watching Rico too closely, following his every move, lingering in places where he could catch a glimpse of him. Rico noticed. One night, everything changed. It started with a moment too long. A routine patrol turned into a whispered conversation. A challenge. A dare. Then came the secret meetings. The stolen moments in the shadows. Desmond tried to tell himself it was nothing, a slip, a mistake, a lapse in judgment. But it wasn't nothing. It was something more, something neither of them could deny. The law enforcer had now become entangled in the very thing he had once condemned most. Desmond Tate had spent his entire life preaching discipline, power, and self-control. But behind those prison walls, in the dark corners where no cameras could see, he had become everything he once feared. The deeper he fell into Rico's world, the harder it became to keep his secret buried. It began as nothing more than routine, a search, a pat down, a moment that should have meant nothing. But for Desmond, that moment was the beginning of his downfall. The first time he felt Rico's body under his hands, he told himself it was just another job, another inmate, another duty. But something shifted, something he wasn't ready to face. He should have looked away faster. He should have forgotten the way Rico smirked at him like he knew a secret Desmond refused to admit. But he couldn't. Every interaction after that felt different. The next time Desmond searched Rico's cell, his hands lingered just a second too long. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of hesitation. But Rico caught it, and that's when the game began. Rico had a way of getting under people's skin. But with Desmond, it was different. He saw through him. "You got a problem with me, Officer Tate?" Rico asked one day, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Desmond like a challenge. Desmond clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay composed. "No, just doing my job." Rico chuckled, that knowing, dangerous chuckle. "Nah, you got a problem with yourself." That was the first time Desmond felt the real weight of fear, not fear of Rico. Not fear of what he might say, but fear of how right he was. Desmond tightened his control after that. He tried to avoid Rico. But prison was a small world, and fate had other plans. One night, during a routine lockdown, everything changed. Desmond was making his rounds when he heard muffled voices coming from Rico's cell. A conversation that should have been silent after lights out. Frustrated, he stormed in. "Lights out means lights out. Valentine." Rico was lying on his cot, one arm behind his head, that same infuriating smirk on his lips. "Relax, officer. Just talking to myself." Desmond stepped closer, too close. And that's when it happened. Rico reached up, not touching him, not breaking any rules, just hovering so close that Desmond could feel the heat of his skin. A test, a taunt, a moment that felt like it lasted forever. Desmond's heart raced, and for the first time in his career, he realized that this was no longer about control. Desmond should have stepped back. He didn't. Instead, he stood there, breathing heavily, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. "I don't scare easy," Rico whispered. "You? I think you're terrified." Desmond snapped, grabbing Rico by the collar and yanking him up. Anger, frustration, and confusion boiled over inside him. Rico didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He just stared, and then he smiled. That moment, Desmond knew he was lost. What followed wasn't immediate, it was slow, calculated, and forbidden. At first, it started with late-night cell checks that lasted longer than necessary. Glances that held too much weight. Whispers in empty corridors. A brush of hands in passing. And stolen moments in the dark. Desmond fought it, telling himself it was nothing. But Rico knew better. He pushed the limits, teased, and dared Desmond to take the next step, and eventually, he did. It was supposed to be a routine check. A moment that should have come and gone like every other night. But this night was different. The prison was quieter than usual. Most of the inmates were asleep, and the halls were dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Desmond Tate should have been finishing his rounds. He should have been anywhere else but standing outside Rico Valentine's cell. Heart pounding, palms slick with sweat. Rico was waiting. He always was. Seated on his cot, arms draped lazily over his knees. He didn't say a word when Desmond entered. He didn't have to. The silence between them stretched thick with unspoken tension. Desmond took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the concrete, the only sound in the small space. He told himself he was in control, that this was just another interaction, another inmate. But Rico's eyes, they burned into him, sharp, knowing. You ever get tired of pretending? Rico's voice was low, taunting, daring. Desmond's jaw clenched. He wanted to walk away. He should have, but he didn't. He reached for Rico, grabbing the front of his jumpsuit and yanking him up with too much force. Too much emotion. Rico let out a breath, a pause. A moment where the world outside that cell didn't exist. Then, without thinking, without logic or restraint, Desmond's lips crashed against Rico's. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, messy, a release of years of denial and frustration. Rico responded immediately, his hands gripping Desmond's uniform, pulling him in, matching his hunger. For the first time in his life, Desmond wasn't the one in control, and he liked it. That night was the first. But it wasn't the last. At first, they thought they were careful, late nights, empty hallways, dark corners. But secrets don't stay hidden in prison. Not for long. It started small, side glances from inmates, a smirk from a fellow officer, conversations that went silent when Desmond walked in. Then came the direct comments. Yo, Tate, you've been getting real close with Valentine? You got a favorite in here, officer? Desmond ignored them at first, brushing them off as inmates stirring trouble. But deep down, he knew people were watching. People were talking. One night, another officer, Sergeant Willis, pulled him aside. You need to be careful, Tate. The warden's been hearing things. Hearing what? Desmond wanted to ask, but he already knew the answer. Fear settled in, fear he hadn't felt before. Not fear of getting caught, but fear of what it meant if the rumors were true. Paranoia crept in. Desmond started avoiding Rico, cutting off the late nights, stopping the stolen touches, ignoring the tension that never really went away. But it wasn't enough. One morning, Desmond woke up drenched in sweat, with swollen glands and aching joints. He felt the first wave of panic. He convinced himself it was stress. Maybe the guilt was finally eating him alive. But then the fatigue worsened. The headaches, the lingering flu-like symptoms. And then came the weight loss. People noticed, even his wife. You're not yourself, Desmond. Maybe you should see a doctor. The words hit harder than he expected. He had no choice. He had to get tested. At the Claiborne Correctional Medical Unit, Desmond sat in the cold, sterile room, his heart pounding in his chest. The nurse barely looked at him as she prepped the test. But Desmond's mind was racing. The truth was closing in, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep running from it. Desmond told himself it was just a routine screening, a simple blood test, the fourth-generation HIV test, one of the most advanced tests available, able to detect both HIV antibodies and antigens even in the earliest stages of infection. Just a small vial of blood, that's all it would take. But as he sat there in the sterile, cold room, waiting for the results, the weight of what was coming slowly settled on his chest. 3 days later, the results came in. HIV positive. His stomach dropped, his vision blurred, his world, everything he had built, everything he had believed about himself, shattered in an instant. He could barely hear the doctor explaining treatment options. Viral loads, CD4 counts, none of it mattered. In Desmond's mind, there was only one person to blame. Rico Valentine. The secret that Desmond had tried to keep buried for so long had finally caught up to him. The moment he realized he was infected, the weight of his own actions came crashing down on him, the shame, the guilt, the fear. Everything he had tried so desperately to bury now had a name: HIV. It wasn't just a diagnosis anymore, it was a ticking time bomb. And Desmond knew exactly who was responsible for planting it in his life. Rico Valentine had turned Desmond's world into a living nightmare. Desmond had been so sure his secret would remain hidden, that his affair with Rico, the forbidden attraction he couldn't shake, would stay buried in the shadows. But now the reality was impossible to escape. And as Desmond sat in his car that night, the anger inside him grew like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. A dark thought took root. He has to die. Rico had done this to him. It was because of Rico that his whole world was about to unravel. Desmond couldn't face the shame of his family, his coworkers, his church, and, most importantly, he couldn't face himself. The infection, the truth, it all pointed back to Rico. If the truth came out, everything Desmond had built would crumble. His career, his reputation, his family, everything would be destroyed. The plan was simple, almost too simple, and like everything else in Desmond's life, it had to be clean. The execution had to be flawless. Murder wasn't the goal, not at first, but in the heat of his rage, it became the only solution. Desmond learned that Rico would be working the night shift alone in his cell. Desmond spent the entire day pacing, rehearsing what he would do. His mind kept playing out the same horrific scenario. But the deeper he thought about it, the clearer it became. No one would ever know. At 10:15 p.m., Desmond's shift began. He walked through the halls of Claiborne Correctional Facility like he had done 1,000 times before. His uniform was spotless, his gun holstered at his side, and his mind was sharp. But underneath the routine, a darkness bubbled just beneath the surface. Desmond knew this night would be different. He made his way to Rico's cell. The lights had dimmed, and the prison was quiet except for the distant sounds of muffled voices. Rico was sitting on his cot, staring at the wall, as if he already knew what was coming. Desmond didn't hesitate. He approached the bars and watched as Rico looked up, flashing that familiar smirk. "Officer Tate," Rico said, his voice dripping with the same cocky confidence that always drove Desmond mad. Desmond said nothing in return. Instead, he unlocked the door and stepped inside the cell. The door shut behind him with a resounding echo that rang through the empty hallway. Rico stood up, his playful smirk never leaving his face. "What is this, Tate? You here to finish what we started?" Rico took a step closer to Desmond, testing him, as he always did. The tension between them was thick, palpable. Desmond's hands shook, but he gripped the gun firmly. This was the only way, he told himself. His heart raced, but he couldn't go back. There was no other choice. "You ruined me," Desmond spat, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm not the one who should be ashamed. You are. You infected me. You made me do things I never should have done." Rico's face shifted. The cocky grin fell for a moment, and Desmond saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. A realization that something wasn't right. But it was too late for that. Desmond had made his decision. "You don't understand," Desmond continued, his words coming faster now, driven by desperation. "I had everything. My family, my career, my dignity. All of it, and you destroyed it." Rico's voice softened, just a hint of something else in his eyes. But it was too little. Too late. Desmond stood frozen, the weight of what he had just done crashing down on him. He had been so sure, so convinced that this was the only way. But now, as he stared at Rico, lying lifeless on the floor, his hands shook uncontrollably, the gun still heavy in his grip. The shot had been loud, almost deafening. Yet the silence that followed felt even heavier. Rico's eyes were wide with shock, a gasp escaping his lips. But the life drained from him quickly. He tried to speak, but the words never came. Desmond stood over him, watching the light leave Rico's eyes, the blood pooling around him. It was over, and as the minutes passed, a dark realization began to settle in Desmond's mind. This wasn't just about the affair or the HIV. This was about his need for control. Desmond Tate had always prided himself on his self-discipline, his ability to keep everything in order. But in that moment, he had destroyed more than just an inmate. He had destroyed a part of himself. The anger had clouded his judgment, and now there was no undoing the damage. His grip tightened on the gun, and he quickly wiped it clean with a cloth, making sure there were no traces of his fingerprints. Then, without looking back, he stepped out of the cell and locked the door behind him. The deed was done. Desmond Tate had just committed murder. And for what? To protect his secret? To erase his guilt? The weight of the crime settled heavily on him as the hours passed. And Desmond realized there was no escape from what he had done. No matter how carefully he tried to cover it up, the truth had a way of coming to light. And now the truth about Desmond, once the perfect correctional officer, the devoted family man, was more dangerous than ever. When Desmond reported the murder, his version of events seemed airtight. He claimed he had responded to a routine situation in the cell, where Rico Valentine had become agitated and violent. Desmond had acted in self-defense. He said, "It was a predictable story. The officer doing his duty. The inmate escalating into violence. And the necessary response to preserve order." To most, it seemed plausible. Desmond had been a model correctional officer for over a decade. He was known for his stoic demeanor. A man of authority who would never make an impulsive decision. His account checked out, and the prison's initial internal review cleared him. There were no signs of foul play in the security logs. No immediate red flags in his actions. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The inmates were the first to whisper. They had seen the tension between Desmond and Rico long before the night of the murder. It wasn't just the usual prison animosity, it was personal. They saw the glances, the exchanged words, and the anger that always bubbled under the surface when Desmond and Rico shared the same space. The rumors were nothing new in a prison, there was always talk. But this time, the whispers were louder, more insistent. One inmate, Charles, Chucky, Martin, a seasoned criminal with a knack for staying in the loop, spoke up. Chucky had been in the cell block that night, and while the guards were busy with their usual routines, he caught a glimpse of the confrontation between Desmond and Rico. Chucky's story was more direct. He told detectives that he had heard raised voices coming from the adjacent cells just before the shot rang out. But the tone of the argument wasn't defensive, it wasn't about an inmate attacking an officer. Chucky said that Desmond had been talking to Rico, practically pleading with him. Chucky overheard a few words. "You don't get to ruin me, Rico," and "You've taken everything from me." It was enough to raise eyebrows. Then came the security footage, or rather, the lack of it. Desmond had claimed that the situation unfolded quickly and that he had acted instinctively. Yet the security cameras in the hallway outside Rico's cell had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. The cracks in Desmond's story were beginning to show. The truth, it seemed, was already making its way to the surface. And it would take more than a well-rehearsed lie to keep it buried. The cell footage had gone dark for several minutes. This wasn't a mere glitch, it was clear. Intentional tampering. The footage was absent for the exact window of time when the shooting took place. Desmond had done everything in his power to ensure that no evidence remained. But the prison's oversight team was starting to piece things together. The missing footage was the first major crack in Desmond's carefully constructed facade. Detective Janelle Harper, a sharp and no-nonsense investigator from Internal Affairs, was called in to review the case. Harper wasn't easily swayed by the official narrative, and she had heard the rumors circulating within the prison. She had a reputation for exposing corruption, and her instincts told her something was off about Desmond's story. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deep she had to dig. Harper immediately noted the inconsistencies. Desmond had been far too composed in his initial statement, almost too quick to cover every angle. His reaction didn't align with someone who had just witnessed a violent outburst from an inmate. What stood out even more was Desmond's history with Rico Valentine. Their relationship wasn't typical for an officer and an inmate, it was far too personal. Far too charged. As Harper dug deeper into Desmond's life, she uncovered a troubling pattern of behavior. Desmond had spent an unusually high amount of time with Rico in the months leading up to the murder. The two men had shared moments that bordered on inappropriate. Far too much familiarity for a correctional officer and a prisoner. There were reports of private conversations in hidden corners of the facility. Long stares exchanged in the break room, and private messages passed between them under the radar. Then came the bombshell. A few weeks before his death, Rico Valentine had undergone a routine medical test. His HIV status had been checked, and the results had come back negative. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Desmond's rage over being infected was misplaced. Rico hadn't given him the virus. Desmond had either been infected by someone else or had been lying to himself about the timeline. The fact that Rico was clean contradicted Desmond's entire motivation for murder. Desmond hadn't killed Rico to cover up his own exposure, he had killed him to silence the threat of being exposed. Harper's investigation uncovered that Desmond had been battling his own demons long before that night. His affair with Rico hadn't been just a sexual entanglement, it had been a reckless attempt to fill a void in his life. Desmond, the proud officer, the upstanding man, had let his desires spiral out of control. And when Rico threatened to reveal their secret, Desmond made the decision that he couldn't let that happen. But the truth was beginning to surface. Desmond hadn't just killed an inmate, he had killed an innocent man who had never intended to harm him. Rico had been nothing more than a scapegoat for Desmond's own shame and guilt. Desmond's story was already beginning to unravel. And as Harper dug deeper, it became clear that the consequences of his actions would be far greater than anyone could have predicted. The evidence was stacking up against him, his lies, his manipulation, and the truth about what really happened that night were all coming to light. The investigation was far from over. But Desmond Tate's days of hiding in the shadows were numbered. The truth was falling apart piece by piece. And it wouldn't be long before Desmond was forced to face the consequences of his deadly choices. Desmond Tate's arrest sent shockwaves through the media. The once revered correctional officer, the man who had walked through prison halls with the air of authority, now found himself shackled and paraded in front of the cameras. His world was crumbling around him. News outlets pounced on the story, splashing his face across newspapers and flashing his name in bold letters across television screens. The public couldn't get enough of the scandal. The powerful prison officer brought down by the very system he once upheld. At home, Desmond's life was in ruins. Desmond's life continued to unravel. Piece by piece, his wife, Latasha, who had stood by him through earlier tensions, could no longer bear the weight of the lies, the deception, and the painful truth about his affair with Rico Valentine. Heartbroken, she packed her bags and walked out of their home, leaving behind the man she thought she knew. Desmond had always been distant, but now, he was a stranger, a man whose secrets were too dark to overlook. His children, once proud of their father's career and accomplishments, turned their backs on him. They couldn't comprehend how the man who had raised them, who had set an example of discipline and respect, could devolve into someone capable of murder. Desmond's oldest son, Marcus, gave a tearful interview on local television, expressing his disgust and disbelief. "I never thought my dad could do something like this," he said. He was supposed to protect people, not hurt them. And then there were his colleagues, the men and women with whom he had worked for years. The very same people who had once praised and respected him now couldn't bear to look at him. Desmond had always been the golden child of the department, the model officer, but now his colleagues turned their backs on him, refusing to even acknowledge his presence in court. The respect he had once commanded in the prison was now completely gone. He was a pariah, not just to the inmates, but to the very system he had once served. The trial began with a heavy atmosphere, an unspoken tension that hung over every proceeding in the courtroom. Desmond's defense team, still clinging to the idea that Rico had been violent and deserving of his fate, tried to paint Desmond as a man pushed to his breaking point. They argued that Desmond had acted in self-defense, that Rico had instigated the confrontation. But the evidence didn't support their claims. Detective Janelle Harper's testimony proved crucial. She recounted her investigation in vivid detail, painting a picture of a calculated man who had used his power to manipulate the truth. The missing security footage, the questionable relationship between Desmond and Rico, and the bombshell revelation of Rico's clean HIV status, all of these details chipped away at Desmond's defense. Harper's words cut through the courtroom, leaving little doubt about the officer's guilt. The prosecution was unrelenting. They brought forth key witnesses, those who had overheard Desmond's words in the prison halls, those who had witnessed heated arguments between him and Rico. Chucky's testimony was damning, describing the tense confrontations between the two men and how Desmond had threatened Rico in private. The defense had no answer for the testimony and no counter for the mounting evidence. The emotional weight of the case, the betrayal of trust, the murder of an innocent man, was too much to ignore. When the jury deliberated, it took less than a day to reach a verdict. The evidence was clear, the motive was understood, and the truth was undeniable. The jury returned with their decision: first-degree murder. Desmond Tate had killed Rico Valentine in cold blood, and there was no question that he would face the consequences. The judge, a stern figure with years of experience, didn't mince words as he handed down the sentence: life in prison. No parole, no chance at redemption. Desmond's fate was sealed. As the gavel came down, Desmond sat motionless, his face betraying no emotion. There were no tears, no remorse in his eyes, just the cold, hard realization of what he had done. The once proud officer was now nothing more than a criminal, reduced to the same status as the very inmates he had once controlled. The ultimate irony of Desmond's sentence was impossible to ignore. The man who had been responsible for maintaining order within the prison system, the one who had been the ultimate authority figure, was now reduced to just another inmate. He would face the same brutality, the same violence, the same struggles as those he had once held in his grasp. Desmond's power had evaporated, and his role in the system was gone. In prison, he would be stripped of everything: his uniform, his rank, his privileges. No longer an officer, the man who once controlled others would now be controlled. His days of holding sway over inmates were over. In fact, he would likely find himself at the mercy of those he had once overseen. The irony was thick. Each day, he would face the harsh realities of the very system he had manipulated. As Desmond was escorted out of the courtroom, the silence was deafening. The world around him had changed, and all he had left was a life behind bars. The betrayal he had committed against Rico, his family, and the entire justice system had finally caught up with him. There was no escaping it now. Desmond Tate would pay for his actions, just like every other criminal who had ever walked through the prison doors he had once guarded. But unlike the inmates he had once controlled, Desmond had no power to manipulate the system. He was at its mercy. As he was led to the holding cells, Desmond knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. For years, Desmond had hidden who he really was. He chose violence over truth, hatred over acceptance, and in the end, it destroyed him. Rico didn't deserve to die, but Desmond couldn't bear to let the world see who he truly was. How far will people go to protect a lie? Do you think Desmond was a victim of his own self-hatred? Or was he simply a murderer trying to cover his tracks? What would have happened if he had just accepted the truth? If you found this case shocking, disturbing, and eye-opening, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Real-Life Crime Stories. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more.